some of you are my students right now in the data visualization class. Some of you had me for MFIN, others for Toolbox. Some never seen me before and probably never see me again because you're graduating in August. I want to welcome you all for coming in today. We're expecting a larger group. I was told that there's action projects going on and some students are finishing up with that. Thank you again for coming. We have Jason Schumacher with us. He is a manager of academic programs at Tableau Software in Seattle. He will give you a debrief about the company itself. It's a great application to learn and use. The MBA students, many of them, 127 of them, are taking the class right now as their last elective. He's been with the company for over 2 years. And he has worked in analytics with various companies before. He flew in last night from New York to be with us today, all day. So we're very grateful for his time. When he opened up the QA session, I encourage you to ask questions. And then we'll be finishing up on time because I think there's a class starting here at 1 o'clock. So we'll be also sensitive of his time to pack up and get out of the classroom with me since another faculty will be walking in. Okay? So without further ado, thank you, Jason. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether I've had an introduction that kind for quite some time. How's the audio sound? Are we at a good level? Yeah. I feel a little self-conscious wearing a mic. I usually just yell louder. But if this works, this works. So thanks for taking the time out of your lunch hour to chat with me a little bit. What I've put together for us to talk about a little bit is kind of the broad approach regarding data analytics, visualization, and digital storytelling that we're really coming into right now. I think that we've been in an age where we've been thinking about visual data for maybe about a couple of years, but we're really just on the cusp of what we call digital storytelling. And so I want to spend some time focusing on that, and I want to talk about how you can end up taking advantage of this trend, and how you can end up getting some advantage of this over time. And so I want to start by talking a little bit about kind of where we see data these days. And I personally think that data is everywhere, and that data has always been everywhere. But we're just starting to realize a little bit more how many places we end up seeing it on a day-to-day basis. So one example here, and I live in Seattle, so I'm sorry for the cheap jab, but one place that we end up seeing this is we end up seeing it in sports. So how many people have done fantasy league, fantasy football, anything along those lines in the past couple of years? All right. All right. I did my first fantasy football league this past year, and I know absolutely nothing about football, but it was a blast. But I think that the overall idea behind sports enthusiasts or any sort of hobby is you want to track those facts, you want to track those figures. And so we're talking about data here. We're talking about gathering, analyzing, synthesizing it, and much of the time we end up thinking that we end up going with our gut. And that does play a big role in terms of the decisions we make, the teams that we pick, and the teams that we root for. But we also use that data that we've assembled, those facts and those figures, as part of that synthesis. We've also ended up seeing data play a more prominent role in things like politics. So does anyone recognize what particular map this is up here? This was a 2012 map. Anyone recognize who created this? Anyone guess?
Nate Silver.
Nate Silver. So Nate Silver is a statistician. He's probably one of the top statisticians. I'm kind of amazed that that is a phrase these days, but he's one of the popular statisticians who ends up talking about statistics in a very, very public setting and is well respected. And so what he ended up doing for the 2012 presidential election in the US is he accurately predicted how 50 of 50 states would swing. And this was more impressive, this was more accurate than any of the political pundits, more than the people who had been in the political prediction game for 30 years. And he did it with a fundamental understanding of statistics and the data behind it. And so in March of 2014, this is an article headline from The Verge, he ended up launching a new site. He ended up launching a new news site called 538, named after his blog. And this new news site is focused on essentially data journalism. Data comes first, the journalism comes in and ends up interpreting that data and framing it. And so this is starting to become the new approach when people are thinking about and talking about data. Data also doesn't necessarily just come in forms where we're talking about numbers, statistics, and figures. When we look at something like an Amazon review, we've got a lot of data here, and a lot of it is unstructured. So there's a big difference between structured and unstructured data in terms of how we work with it. But when you think about how many review sites there are around, I mean, if you just think about places like, Yelp, Amazon, any place where you end up providing some sort of input, some sort of comment, usually 1 star through 5 stars, you're contributing data that ends up helping other people make decisions. And so, as a marketer, marketing, the entire industry is having to evolve into a place where people have more perfect information. Brands matter a little bit less because people can go online and they can see, well, does this Sony live up to this brand reputation that I've identified it with? Or is it really going to be just a trash product that's trying to rely on this Sony brand too much? And of course, we have metadata collection, metadata. And so data is being collected about cell phones. Data is being collected about emails. Data is being collected about websites that we traffic through. Data is really everywhere, and data collection is everywhere as well. And so when we traditionally talk about big data, how familiar of a phrase is that for people? Pretty familiar? Okay. So you're probably familiar with how it's traditionally defined. It's defined by the 3 V's: volume, variety, and velocity. And so this is talking about, we have lots of data. We have data that's in different places. Some of it's structured, some of it's unstructured, some of it is written down on a pad of paper. So how do we synthesize this information together? And then when we talk about velocity, we're also talking about the fact that we're generating so much data. It's new data. And it's also immediately actionable data. We need to be able to move on this information as quickly as possible to take advantage of it. And then there is a 4th V in here that people sometimes use, and it's veracity. So how much do we trust the data? And so this is an important part as well. If you can't trust the data, can you trust the conclusions that come out of it? So the answer there is no. And so the real challenge right now is not collecting data. It's managing it. It's making meaning out of it. It's trying to understand what's happening with it, because there's already so much of it out there that's being underutilized or not utilized at all. And this is true in a public sphere, this is true in the private sector, this is true personally for you and I. How many people here have a Fitbit? Not as many people as I would expect. If I do this in Seattle, like half the people raise their hands. I'm not sure what that says about us. But anyway, so we have all this data lying around. And sometimes we don't know what to do with it. It's too overwhelming for us to be able to manage. So what we're really doing at Tableau, how this kind of comes back to the company that I work for, is that we think that the fundamental idea of how people have been working with data for the past 20 and 30 years is fundamentally broken. So before coming to Tableau, I ended up working as a data analyst at a healthcare company. A healthcare agency, and so we ended up contracting out our services to basically just Fortune 500 companies that were in the healthcare space, and so we'd end up doing just whatever work they wanted done for them. And so I ended up doing a lot of data analytics for these clients that ended up coming to us. And what I found is that my job ended up consisting a lot of working with a spreadsheet in Excel, rejiggering that spreadsheet depending on what we needed, spending 10 or 20 hours a week actually working on this thing, getting it into a final mode where I was proud to present it, give it to someone, and they say, oh, it's no longer relevant. We needed that yesterday. But you told me about it yesterday. Yeah, we needed it yesterday. And so this is the traditional process of how data has really been analyzed. It's a separated process from the people who are actually making decisions. How many people in here have ended up working in a company where they have needed data and they've needed to go to someone else to get it? All right, so most people in here have experienced that. And did it take some time to get that data back? Did you get put in a queue? Did you get told that you had a ticket for this? And at some point later, you got that information. And it might be right, it might not be, it might be relevant, it might not be. There are just too many questions about it at that point. And this is what I mean by it's broken. What we want to do with Tableau is we want to put the power of analytics in the hands of business users who are working with the data. So if you're making a decision about a company, you should be able to access that data. You shouldn't have to put in a ticket or a request to someone in order to get access to that data, that you need to be able to make an informed decision. And so where we kind of came from is we were founded in 2003 by a trio of Stanford affiliated people. One person was a Stanford MBA, one person was a Stanford PhD, computer science student, and one person was a Stanford professor. And the three of them had worked on a project that was called Polaris. This was the PhD project for the computer science student. And this project ended up focusing on the visual representation of data. And what it was doing is it was actually working with the Department of Defense in helping them more efficiently understand their information. And so once the PhD project concluded, the three of them decided to try to bring this to a broader population than just the DoD, or push it beyond the lab of the Stanford Computer Science Department and see whether it had legs in terms of a business proposition. And in 2003, the market probably wasn't ready for it. In 2003, people hadn't nearly experienced the pain of going through this traditional data management, this traditional data queue. But over the years, people started to get frustrated. They started to want to be able to get quick answers from the data. And this is reasonable. This is a reasonable request that people want to be able to make data-driven decisions. And so we've grown and grown. We've gone from a 3-person company to a company of over 1,300. We went public last year. We have offices in Seattle. We have an office in Menlo Park. We have an office in Austin, Singapore, Japan, and we have one in London. And I think that's all. We might have more. But we have a lot of offices now. Our product has been adopted by over 17,000 customers. And I'll give you just a quick rundown in a few minutes of some of the customers and how they've ended up using Tableau in their institutions. But before I get to that, when we look at this information up here, this is kind of the traditional way that we're used to looking at information, that we're used to understanding information that's put in front of us. Whether we want to call this a table, a spreadsheet, a crosstab, whatever nomenclature we want to use here, what we're looking at is we're looking at the traditional way that we look at information. Now, if we end up caring about NHL stats, so this is hockey information up here. If we end up caring about NHL stats, this is probably important to us. We'll probably bite the bullet and start digging into this information. But wouldn't we just rather have this? So what we have here is we have a simple visualization. It's just a scatter plot that maps out assists versus goals by player. And it ends up giving us something that's a little bit more of a snapshot into that data. Now, it's worth comparing this or this. Which one's more appealing? Which one's more understandable at the get-go? And so what's really going on here is that the traditional way that we look at information, and honestly that we analyze information, is really focused on the information itself. It's about gathering that information and structuring it. And we traditionally haven't made a division between gathering it, structuring it, and analyzing it, and communicating it. And so what we think is that crosstabs and spreadsheets are great for gathering the information in the first place. But in terms of telling a story and presenting some information, they're not that great. When it comes to visuals, those are good at getting insights out of that information. And fundamentally, that's what we want to do with information. We care about information as a means to an end. It needs to be able to help us learn something about our business or our personal lives or our hobbies. We need to be able to derive some meaning from that in order to be able to make that information worthwhile in the first place. So I want to take a couple of seconds, and this is the interactive portion. This is a grid of basically semi-random numbers. This is a little bit of a proof of concept for visualization as a whole. Take the next 20 seconds. Let me know how many 9s there are in here. And just yell it out if you see how many there are. So we have 44, 6, I think I heard 8, 5. Okay, so somewhere around like the 5 to 8 range. 9. We keep going up. All right. Here we go. So I've gone ahead and I've colored the 9s red. How many 9s are there? So this exercise is intended to be illustrative of the points of visualization. When we start to use visual elements with our data, it makes it easier to understand. And so it's not just about the presentation of hockey statistics as a scatter plot. It's about understanding information more quickly. It's about coming to understanding more efficiently than through conventional channels of looking at crosstabs and raw numbers. When we start to incorporate these visual elements, we save ourselves time. And let me put this in a business context. Let's say that we have a data analyst for our company, and this person makes $90,000 a year. This person also works 40 hours a week. It's probably an understatement, but let's assume that they work 40 hours a week and they work 48 weeks out of the year. We'll give them a little bit of vacation. If we go ahead and we save them 25% of their time, it's pretty big. If we can save them 25% of their time when they're working with data, if they're a data analyst, that's probably what they're doing most of their time. We end up saving them over $20,000 to the company, just in terms of being more efficient, being able to work on more projects, being able to take on more responsibility, being able to take on a larger load. And to put it in a personal sense, it's almost 2,000 hours that they will have saved. And think about what you could do with an extra 10 hours a week. I can't even think about it because I have so much going on. I don't put the time into thinking about what I could do with 10 more hours. But it would be magical, right? We're all busier than we want to be. And if it could give you 10 hours back, it'd be pretty valuable. So I want to go over a couple of case studies that we've ended up developing in conjunction with some companies that we've helped be really successful using Tableau. So Cisco, networking company, Fortune 100. I'm sure everyone has heard of them. This desk is the desk I have on my desk at work. Very ubiquitous. In 2007, they were starting to feel the frustrations of the way that they were working with data. There was one department in particular that dealt with consumer sentiment, and they had a lot of data lying around that they simply weren't using because they didn't know how to work with it. And they didn't have the technical resources to be able to have on hand to really do a deep dive into that data. And they didn't want to go through that ridiculous queue that they would have to if they engage with external groups within the company. And so they started engaging with Tableau. They started out pretty small. They started out with a few copies of Tableau Desktop for the people who wanted to work with that data. And eventually what they ended up doing is, unbeknownst to IT, they ended up installing an instance of Tableau Server, which is our enterprise level product. And they installed this on a spare desktop machine. They shoved it underneath someone's desk so that IT wouldn't find out. And so when I hear this story, I end up thinking, this is the type of thing that never gets turned off, has a big post-it note on top that says, do not turn it off, that's Sharpie on. But the IT department did end up finding out. They found out that they were running this unauthorized server. But it wasn't because anything went wrong. It wasn't because alarm bells went off in terms of IT. It's because the group that had implemented the Tableau server ended up coming up with some really cool observations about what their consumers were doing. And so got a lot of attention, got attention of the CEO of the company, and that's how IT ended up learning about it. They learned about it not because it was a violation, not because it was a breach, but they learned about it by virtue of what the users who had implemented it were able to get out of the information that was really black box to them up until that point. And so, since 2007, Cisco has become a little bit more open. There are no longer servers sitting underneath people's desks, to the best of our knowledge. And so they end up having one of the larger enterprise-level deployments of Tableau of any of the companies that we work with. I mentioned that we have about 17,000 customers that we've worked with. And their deployment is rather large. They have an entire division that's built out to self-service analytics and helping people answer their own problems that they have with data within the overall company. And one other piece that I'll quickly touch on, another company, Deloitte Consulting is also probably one of the largest users of Tableau as well. Every one of their consultants that ends up going out in the field has a copy of Tableau installed on their machine. And they end up using Tableau as a frontline tool. When they end up working with customers in the first place, when they start to try to delve into that information that they're being given, that they're being tasked to analyze and be able to optimize, they'll turn to Tableau as a first stage to start to learn what that information is really telling them. So, with all of this talk that I've been mentioning here, it kind of leads me to think that data visualization, I mean, this is this new field, right? This is this new thing that people are just suddenly embracing. But the truth of that really isn't there. Data visualization has been around for hundreds of years. It's actually pretty fundamental in terms of the development of statistics. And so I want to walk through a few of these historical examples and explain how visualization has led to some results. It's also an excuse to show some pretty graphs. So this first one is probably, this is one of the quintessential graphs in data visualization. This is a very, very simple graph that was developed by a man named William Playfield. He's a Scottish economist who ended up publishing this in, I think, the late 1790s. And what he's showing here isn't really all that drastic or radical. Take a look at this, and what we've got going on here is we have two lines. That's all we have going on here. We have a line of imports, and we have a line of exports. And they end up crossing at some point. But really, all we're doing is we're plotting data points. We're plotting exports and imports on this graph. It's very, very simple. But it's also very fundamental because no one had done this before. And he does add some visual flair here. He ends up saying, this is a balance against England. This is a balance in favor of England, which really helps us understand at first glance what this chart is telling us. But this is, honestly, a very simple visualization. We see a lot of visualizations today that are much, much more complicated than this, that are telling much, much smaller stories. This next visualization requires a lot of explanation, so I'm going to keep this one brief. This is a map of Napoleon's march on Moscow, drawn out as a data visualization. And this is a visualization that was developed in 1850s or so by a man named Charles Menard. I fully recommend, if you have your computer out right now, just Google Charles Menard Napoleon map. Find a high-resolution file of this. There are good high-resolution files out of this, and take a look at it later, because there are so many things going on in here. What this chart doesn't do is it doesn't allow us to understand at first glance what's happening. But it is such a multivariate chart. We end up having so many different elements here along the lines of French troops, their positioning, their movements, their size, when brigades split off, when they rejoin, where they're at, significant battles, supply lines. We have so much information packed into this visual. This is one of the classic pieces of data visualization because it ends up reasonably elegantly portraying so much information in such a contained package. So take a look at it later. High resolution is really required. This doesn't do it justice. And then here's the third story. This is actually my favorite of the three. This is a story about a London physician named John Snow. Not of Game of Thrones fame. And John Snow was a physician in the 1850s, which was really, frankly, a pretty early time in terms of modern medicine. And he was a physician during a large cholera epidemic in London. And this was before germ theory. And so what was the traditional idea of how cholera spread was through bad air. And so the only way to really escape this bad air was to get out of the area. And so this physician, John Snow, he had some ideas. And he wanted to test this theory. He wanted to see, is it really the bad air, or is there something else going on? And so what he ended up doing is he ended up taking down essentially where people contracted cholera in the greater London area. And he ended up mapping that information. So I'll zoom in a little bit. So this is what he ended up finding. He ended up finding that once he got enough data points, he ended up finding that there was a lot of clustering in terms of cholera outbreaks. And it all centered around one particular area, centered around Broad Street, and specifically the water pump. And it turned out this was a public water pump that a lot of people from the area ended up getting their water from. And this water pump had been constructed recently, and it had been built on top of a cesspit. And so there were a lot of cholera-inducing bacteria that were in the cesspit, the cesspool beneath the well, that people were getting their water from. And so when John Snow went ahead and he mapped this information, he went to the city council and he ended up saying, there's definitely something going on here. I'm paraphrasing. There's definitely something going on here. And they said, okay, what do you suggest? And so he ended up taking the handle off the water pump. And cholera declined rapidly in the area because people were no longer having access to that tainted well. And so this is one of the first cases of the field of epidemiology, understanding public health in the context of environmental conditions. And it started to call into question this idea that disease was conveyed by the air. So it ended up impacting people a lot. It was from, fundamentally, data collection and understanding that data by mapping it. So not all visualizations are equal. That one's probably pretty apparent. We end up seeing a lot of junk charts out there these days. And not all as impactful as maybe John Snow's cholera map, maybe not as pretty as some of the infographics we see, but we also have things all over the spectrum. So a lot of the charts I see are like this. This is really kind of the traditional mockery of the business environment where you've got the pie chart and you've got the line chart. And they're all telling the same thing and they're telling nothing at the same time. So we end up kind of putting things in 4 different fields if we want to go a little meta and use a chart to explain charts. So we have the axes of ugly to beautiful, confusing and clear. And obviously our goal is going to be up in this clear and beautiful zone as much as possible. So what we're looking at here, these are 4 different variations of essentially the same information. We're looking at ample employment history. So I'll go into each one of them. Let's start with kind of this worst quadrant down here, confusing and ugly. So we have this, let me just say, interesting font choice up top for total Apple employees. But in addition to that, we're using a 3D bar chart. And 3D tends to obfuscate the real message here. I can't tell what these precise numbers are because I can't tell whether this is the top point, this is the top point, how it corresponds over here to the actual scale. I don't get all that much information out of this. So Let's move on a little bit. Let's move up to the beautiful section, but still a little bit confusing. We've gone ahead and cleaned up the fonts. We've gone ahead and added a little bit of context. We've gone ahead and added a huge Apple logo here, which I suppose is good. But we still have those 3D bar charts. We're still not able to see what value is being represented by this bar in particular. And actually, this is a little bit more confusing because we've got rid of those grid lines. We used to be able to compare kind of roughly where things were at, 20K, 30K, 40K, but now it's a lot harder for us to see that. All right, so let's move to something that's a little bit more useful, but maybe less elegant. So here we have the dreaded Comic Sans font being used. But in addition to that, this chart is just kind of a little blah. The color scheme here doesn't really help us understand. But that's okay, because we do understand these points. We understand where they lie in the spectrum of employees who are at Apple year over year. And I think it's also pretty useful that we end up having some information that gives us some context into these major product launches that Apple's had. And so, following us into kind of the fourth quadrant, the beautiful and useful quadrant, we end up combining those factors. We no longer have those messy 3D bar charts. We have grid lines back on board. We've also ended up adding a little bit of visual interest. Some people will call this chart junk because it doesn't actually convey specific information, but it does help us understand at a glance what these major product launches are really doing. So I think that this is definitely the best of the four that we ended up seeing. It's not to say that this chart couldn't be improved, but I think that in general, this is a clear, elegant chart that helps us understand what's happening with Apple employment history. Some charts are deceptive though. How many people saw this when it circulated the internet in April? What's going on here? You probably already know this, but I mean the real problem with this chart is the sizes here that are being represented are entirely disproportionate. You glance at this and you don't have the numbers on here, you assume that as of March 27, you're at maybe a third of the enrollment that you want. And so we're not starting to scale at zero. It's not a fair comparison. So this is a way that you can end up distorting what could be a good chart by limiting the axis. We can also end up doing some things that are fun with visuals. I'll let this one speak for itself. But really, the real goal of our charts, any sort of visual that we put together, is to get information out of it. Again, whether we're talking about information that is, whether it's information for our hobbies, whether it's information for work, whether it's information for our personal lives, we want to get some meaning out of it. So this is an example of a sales dashboard that we modeled off of what we use at Tableau. And we have a lot of information on this chart. We have a lot of details in terms of sales over time, by salesperson, revenue by quarter. But also, it's important to note that we also end up having some ability for users to filter for themselves. And so I've mentioned in terms of the Tableau philosophy that it's important for users to be autonomous over the questions they're asking. And so we think it's important that when you end up presenting information to other people, that they're able to drill down into information that's going to be important for them. That if you give them a top-level perspective, let them drill down into the perspective that they need to learn about, whether that's mid-level or maybe even a little bit lower. Some charts can also be fun. They can also be useful in terms of helping people understand things a little bit more effectively. It need not be restricted to the business realm like we have before. Where's Bigfoot seen in the US? I think this is an effective chart in terms of going in and saying, hey, better watch out, West Coast. So, where all of this ends up coming together is, I want to take some time and just show you a quick demonstration of what we can end up doing in Tableau with some data from our website. How many people in here have used Tableau before? Just to get a good sense. Okay. So not too many people. So this will be new material for most of you. It's pretty basic in terms of Tableau, so it might be a little bit of a refresher for people who have already worked with Tableau a bit. So, let's see here. So what I have here is I have a workbook of information. I have an extract of information that we ended up taking from our website. We ended up aggregating it up to a high level. And so that's what we have up here in terms of our website traffic extract. And the way that I'm going to end up working with Tableau is going to be dragging and dropping information. I'm going to drag and drop measures and dimensions to be able to get a top level view of my information to start with. And then I'll take that top level information and I'll drill down to the aspect that I'm more interested in investigating. And so looking at website traffic, I want to see how many visits have we had to our website. So I'll just drag that out under rows. And I end up seeing, wow, we have almost 1 million views to our website during a certain time period, whatever time period this is for. And so in terms of my investigation of this data, if I'm approaching this from scratch, I'm probably going to want to know, well, if I have 1 million visits to my website, am I talking about a 2-day period or a 2-year period? It's going to be a relevant question. So go ahead and drag the date dimension out onto columns, and my view changes a little bit. It tells me that all of this data is from 2013 because we're aggregating it up to the year level. I'll go ahead and change this such that we're looking at it day by day. So now we start to be able to see that we end up topping out at about 65K visits on one particular day, but overall we end up having a lot of fluctuation. Any thoughts about what these dips might end up being? Weekends. That makes sense. So let's go ahead and test that. Let's go ahead and see. Not remember, but we'll change this to weekday. So that's right. We end up seeing that on Sunday and Saturday, we have far fewer visitors to our website, which makes sense. I mean, I think that our software is fun, easy to use, but fundamentally it's B2B software. So people are probably not clamoring to go on Tableau's website and learn about it on Sunday morning. Tell me if I'm wrong, guys. Please prove me wrong as well. So we're able to learn a little bit more based off of kind of this path of investigation. And this is what we call essentially exploratory analytics or data discovery. And so I'm also curious, if we go back, this website data is from November 12th to about December 6th, it looks like. I'm getting cut off there. But if we end up covering the Thanksgiving holiday, is that going to impact things? Is that going to impact our website visits? And so I'm going to go ahead and ask whether that is possibly affecting us. So now what I've done is I've broken us out into weekdays, but I'm also looking at the sequence of time. So looks like there's not all that much variation here, 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 but Thursday, right here, we end up having a steep nosedive, as well as the Friday afterwards. So we end up taking a look at that. It looks like that was November 28th, and that was November 29th. We also ended up having November 27th. So this might not actually be tied to Thanksgiving. It might be something else that's going on as a result of it. So that's interesting. All of that's good. But I also might want to know something along the lines of where my website traffic is coming from. Maybe there isn't all that much dip in terms of website traffic during Thanksgiving because all of our traffic is international. So go ahead and map out my traffic. So I get a map. All I'm seeing on this map so far are the areas where traffic has been coming from. It doesn't tell me anything about it. But if I go ahead and I say, let's take a look at visits, and code it by size, then we start to get some useful information up on here. We're able to see that we do have a lot of traffic from the US. This is the main source of our traffic. But we also have some hotspots. Looks like in the UK, looks like in India, looks like in Australia. We have a lot of traffic going on there as well. And so I am curious to go back to that question I asked earlier about whether this website traffic, this dip, or this dip that I would expect to be there for Thanksgiving is due to the fact that, well, we have a lot of international traffic. And so go ahead and group some of these together. I'm going to say this is going to be the Americas. So call this the Americas. And then I'll also call this, let's call this the EMEA region. So I'll go ahead and rename that. And then everything else, we'll call Asia Pacific. And let's go ahead and change that so that we have some colors that are a little more dynamic. So now we've got our regions grouped through. But the reason I wanted to end up grouping those regions, at least geographically over here, was so I could use them to analyze this sheet. So I can use this country region group that I just created here. And if I drop it onto color, I'm able to see our website traffic changing based off of these three regions that I've just defined here. If I change it to an area chart, I end up seeing, for the Americas, we end up having a pretty deep dip in terms of that Thanksgiving time. Or pre-Thanksgiving, it looks like. And then when we go over here and we actually look at Thanksgiving, we actually have an increase in traffic. Something weird is going on there. People really like Tableau. No, people don't like their in-laws. That's really what's happening. But then again, what am I saying? So we might also want to view this type of information in slightly different format. Regardless of how much visualization has ended up really taking off in the past few years, there are still people who are going to say, yeah, okay, your visualization is nice, it's pretty, but just show me the numbers, just show me the numbers. Anyone know people like that? Are any of you like that? Because I'll change your minds. But what we'll end up doing is we'll end up taking this sheet and we'll end up duplicating it as a crosstab. And so we're going to have to rejigger this a little bit to make this information a little bit presentable. Actually, let me back up here. It might be more information, or it might be more useful for us to actually just look at these regions. So if I go ahead and duplicate that as a crosstab, this is probably a little bit more manageable so we're not looking at day by day. And then let's go ahead and say, maybe I want to look at them both on the same row. And then instead of visits, or in addition to visits, I also want to know how many new visitors I end up having. So now if I want to, I can end up going in here, and I can see in any particular region, I can go ahead and I can see how many new visitors I have and how many visitors I have over this entire time period. So one of the things that I also ended up talking about 20 minutes ago was the idea of synthesis. We want to be able to bring all of our disparate information together, and that's one of the challenges that people end up finding with their data environment today. So let's go ahead and bring that data together. What I'm doing is I'm creating a dashboard. And dashboard is just going to be a visual representation of multiple elements that basically work to be more than the sum of their parts. So I've got my crosstab that I want to work with, I know that. I've also got my area chart, and I've got my map. Let's go ahead and move this area chart down. So now we've got all of our information in one place. It's probably not super helpful for us to have these called Sheet 2, Sheet 1, and Sheet 3. So I'll go ahead and just hide the titles. And we have all of our information together. It's cool to have it together, but it's not useful yet. What we can end up doing is we can end up giving us the ability to filter off of this map. And so if I want to see website traffic only for the United States, now I'm filtering off of this map. Tableau recognizes that I want to filter only for the state that I've selected, and it's going to filter the rest of the information I have down below. And so now this is starting to be a useful resource. This is starting to be something that I can use to look up what's happening with any of these particular regions. And so I might go into a meeting and have to answer a question. Well, what did website traffic look like for Australia over this 3-week period of time? I don't have that prepared ahead of time. I can end up pulling that information up, and I can give precise numbers on the fly. So that's the basic idea behind Tableau. So that we're going to be able to connect to information. We're going to be able to ask questions of it. We're going to be able to go back to those questions that we've already asked. We're going to iterate on those questions. And eventually, we're going to want to share it with other people. We're going to give them some actionable insights out of that information. Because if your information isn't actionable, if it doesn't help people understand things, what's the point? So, what does this mean for you? Let's kind of pull it all together. I think that what this means for you is that this is a zone of opportunity. Working with data, working with stories, working with visuals, this is a prime opportunity for anyone who has the competency to be able to understand both data as well as the business side of things. Part of the reason I mention this are some forecasts that groups have done over the past couple of years. So McKinsey & Company, they end up forecasting that by 2018, there will be 1.5 million jobs in the US that will not have people with the data skills to fill them. It's a lot of people. And these aren't just jobs that end up requiring deep statistical knowledge. These aren't jobs that are going to require you to work with data all day and that's all you do. These are going to be jobs that are a synthesis of both the business sense and the technical sense. And so becoming data-driven storytellers, being people who can analyze data in the first place, make a business case off of it, and then argue that business case, and be able to answer questions off of that, and be able to be that prime person who is in charge of that information and the business plan behind it, I think that's where the opportunity lies. So that's what I've got for our session today. Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
What does your competition look like?
I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. So the competition when we're working with data is pretty fierce. There are a lot of companies that are entrenched and have entrenched interests in business intelligence. So these are going to be big players, SAP, IBM, but they're also going to involve smaller niche players who are moving into the market right now. People who are working on only cloud solutions to business intelligence, or people who are working off of, the same premise that we are, and putting together visualization packages like TIBCO Spotfire and ClickView. So the competition is pretty fierce, but fundamentally, where we see ourselves is we see ourselves as being main competitors with Excel. And the reason that we see this is when you end up going to your computer and working with data, what program do you open first? Excel. And this is where most businesses are as well. There are a bunch of specialized tools out there that are designed to help businesses understand their information. But Excel is kind of that base level. Everyone knows it at least enough to get started with it. That Excel is really the tool that we end up competing with most. Because Tableau is like Excel in many ways, in the sense that it's easy to use, has a lot of depth. It gets very technical if you want it to, but you can also end up keeping it very top level. But the real benefit that we end up seeing with visualization versus not visualization is just how quickly you can get to answers of things. So that's one way of answering the question. Second way is, you can end up looking at competitors, you can end up looking at some of the industry competition notes. So Gartner is a good one. They end up indexing all of the people who work in the business intelligence space, and what they do is they survey customers. And so they end up doing the survey every year, and we're fortunate to have come out very, very much on top this year. And so I don't want to go too much into the details of kind of how we end up differentiating from our competition, or because I think that our customers end up telling that pretty clearly, and that it's going to come better from their mouths as well.
Yeah, so it's the first time that I'm seeing the tool. So do you need to have all the information in Excel in order to start to do the process? Or, and the other question is, are you working with other different programs such as CRM, like taking the information directly?
Sure. So 2 questions there. First off, do I have to have the information in a file? Do I have to have it in an Excel file or a database ahead of time? Yes. So Tableau is not going to help you gather or manage your data in the first place. It's going to help you understand it.
Right.
So it plugs into data that already exists. And the second question is, I mean, do we end up working with things like CRM systems? Do we work with Salesforce? Do we work with Tableau? Do we work with all of these platforms that really all of this data comes from, all this data gets created in it? Yes. So we connect natively to Salesforce, so you can end up going into Tableau, which this figure I'll just do. You can go into Tableau, and you can end up saying, all right, I want to connect to my Salesforce instance, and you'll just go ahead and enter your credentials to do so. It'll pull down an export of that file, and you'll be able to work with that data. And so that's true for a lot of different data environments here. The goal is to say, wherever you have your data, you should be able to work with it.
Are you working on the Dynamics connector?
Dynamic
CRM
connector?
Dynamics.
I do not know.
All right.
That's a good question, but I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah, I'm asking about more technical, like you're not gonna work more like integrating data. So just analyze, I'm just wondering like the data you analyze is like how can I say compatible with what kind of open resources SQL, non-SQL, or Hadoop. So can you explain?
Sure. So this is a good question more about data management, I think, in terms of having, you have different types of data sources and they're formatted in different ways, and you need to figure out how you end up joining disparate data sources to be able to make them talk with each other. And I mean, this is it's a high-level conversation that I can only get a little into. Tableau is not going to help you in terms of managing that data in the first place. You have to make sure that the data is clean before it's going to come to Tableau. There's a little bit of data cleaning that you can do in Tableau, but it's not its strength. The strength is analysis. So in terms of bringing in different data sources, what we end up doing at Tableau is we work off of a lot of systems, I hate to say, but a lot of flat files, as well as a lot of relational databases, as well as a couple of queues. And so what we end up doing is we end up making sure that we end up having specific join points that we're going to be able to use. And so this is something that we've architected in the first place to be able to make sure we're going to be able to join our data on a specific field across almost any of the databases that we use within the company. And so I hope that starts to answer your question. Let's talk a little bit later so I can get more into it. Yeah.
Do you think your competitors or other big companies will acquire you in the future, especially like Microsoft? No, especially when I see you drag different data titles in the tablet, it feels like the pivot table.
Mm-hmm. So other people in the data space have, and they have offered to acquire. They have tried. That was before we went public, and I don't know where things lie right now. But other people have attempted to acquire Tableau and incorporate us into a product suite of sorts, but that's never been really our interest. We've never wanted to be part of a stack, if that's a familiar phrase, because that's how old business intelligence operates. It operates under, you purchase a database from a vendor, you also purchase an analytical platform from a vendor, you also purchase consulting from a vendor, and it just goes entirely up that stack, and it's not especially compatible outside of the stack. And we want to be agnostic of that approach. And so I assume that getting bought out by a company is going to compromise that part of our mission.
Yeah, now that we have attended this workshop, so is there a self-manual to learn this, or is there a course to take it, or how much is the cost for it?
Yes, so a couple ways to answer this. First off, take Professor Sadoi's class. The second answer is we have about 10 hours of free training available to anyone, whether you're a customer or not, whether you want to use Tableau or not, on our website. So that's going to be tablewsoftware.com/learning. And then the other thing, I feel silly for not mentioning this before, but I run the academic program at Tableau. One of those big programs is we offer a free version to students. So I feel silly for not having mentioned that, but you all have free access to Tableau should you want it, so long as you're a student. So just go ahead and Google Free Student Edition Tableau, or visit tablewsoftware.com/students, and we'll get you set up with a free copy.
If you add our school, it's not in there.
Just go ahead and say, it's not
Any?
listed.
Okay.
Go ahead and say other.
Yes. With the Internet of Everything, that is one of the challenges that Cisco is facing right now, the data will be available to everyone. And so the possibility to elaborate data and keep intermediaries will be pretty high. My question is, do you think that this tool will allow to skip the intermediaries that are in the market that are managing the data, and if it's going to happen more or less when?
Can you tell me more about what you mean by intermediaries?
Intermediaries are like organizations that manage data. Like, for example, in the pharmaceutical field, we have IMS that collect all the data from the pharmacists and from the distributors, elaborate, and then send us to us. And then we do further elaboration, but there is a first level that is managed by them.
That's a good question. I think that if you're talking about some sort of middle company that ends up gathering data from disparate sources and distilling it into basically a clean pipe for it to end up using, I think that that's something that is more of a logistical challenge. I mean, if you want to take those disparate data sources and plug them all into Tableau and have them work together, you can do that. But it's going to be harder than going through that middle vendor that ends up packaging them up with a nice bow. So I don't know. It's a great question whether this means the obsolescence of these middlemen in the industry. My gut tells me no. My gut tells me that as we end up continuing along this data-driven trajectory, that we are going to continue to need people who are in essentially the services industry, who are going to be able to manage all of these types of sources of data and distill them into usable forms, because that's one of the big challenges that we face, is usability of the data we gather.
Jason, we have a couple of minutes left, so I want to ask the last question, which many students have asked before. Your certification program, how can they be certified? How much does it cost? And are there any training for the certification preparation exam?
That's a great question. So we have a certification program. It's 2 tiers. One tier is, I forget the nomenclature for it, but there's level 1, there's level 2. And level 1, both of them are actually pretty deep in terms of Tableau. I think that, so I had the pleasure of being in Dr. Sadoi's class earlier today, and the students in that class who have been able to start working with Tableau, they're getting there. They're getting a lot of the education that they need to be able to take certification. But what we recommend is that for the first level of certification, it's about a $300 fee, I think, to take. And it requires, or it highly recommends, that people who take the certification have about 6 months of working with Tableau, that level of experience. And so it's not going to be a certification that you can cram for over a weekend and then put on your resume. It's going to take some serious work in terms of working with data in Tableau, and honestly, facing a lot of the ways that you're going to face Tableau in a business setting. In terms of the prep for that, I'd recommend the place to start is going to be our free online trainings. Again, tableausoftware.com/training, or learning, excuse me. And that's a good place to start, but if you have an opportunity to take a class, if you have an opportunity to attend a user group meeting and ask questions of Tableau users in the San Francisco area, that'd be a fantastic way to get started as well. Yes?
I have a couple of questions, one for the group and one for you. For the group, show of hands, how many of you consider yourselves like data spreadsheet geeks? How many do not consider themselves necessarily spreadsheet geeks? So it's about half-half. The reason I point that out is, I don't know if you went through the bio when you first were introduced, but describe your two majors, your undergrad and grad.
So I have a degree in law from the University of Amsterdam, and I have an undergraduate major in history. So yeah,
I want to just add to the point is that this is about using your intellectual curiosity. It's about using your brain to try to figure things out. It's not about numbers and statistics. It's about seeing relationships and so what. It's the question I always ask people. You've done this work, so what? And getting the insight from the data is always the high value add piece to any analyst's job. So I'm so gratified, frankly, to have so many non-geeks here because I believe that the software is powerful for the non-geeks as well, because we're probably more abstract thinkers if we're not mired in data only. So I would advise non-geeks to adopt, and those geeks to broaden your perspective, to think geographically, think on time dimensions, on these angles that we normally don't think about, because that will ultimately lead to better insights wherever you end up. So that was a question for you all. Thank you very much. Question for you, and I kind of answered, is I went to the website and I looked at jobs, and I see jobs in Asia, Europe, United States, Australia, over 251 jobs. Can you speak to jobs? I know that this is not your purpose, and we tend to not put speakers on the spot, but I think there's a lot of interest in what you do, and I think I'd like to hear what your answer is.
Sure, and that's, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's a low-ball pitch, so I appreciate it.
Good. Glad to give you a little.
So, in terms of the job offerings that we have available, I'll start by kind of where. Geographically, we're a worldwide company. We're starting to move into that realm. We're founded in Seattle, and so that's where our core is. It's where I'm based out of. We have about 500 employees there. But we have offices all throughout the globe. And in addition to that, we have a lot of people who end up working out of home offices throughout the globe. So we don't have an office in Russia. We have people working out of Russia because it's necessary to be in the area in order to perform their jobs. So we end up having jobs available throughout the globe. They're focused in kind of 4 departments. First is going to be probably the smallest. It's going to be the marketing team. That team is about 100 people at this point. It is pretty lean, pretty focused on both Seattle and Menlo Park. So that might be an opportunity if you're interested in that. But in addition, we also end up having a lot of sales roles that are non-traditional kind of sales. So we end up grouping things like training into our sales positions, in the sense that our trainers end up helping spurn the adoption of Tableau, and so that's why they end up falling under the sales category. But they're not selling product. They're not selling Tableau to people. They're helping them understand how to learn how to use the tool. And many of them are people like me. They're non-technical. Many of them are technical. So there's a good mix of that in there. And then we also end up having development and operations, which are a little bit more technical in the realm of things. But we have openings primarily in Seattle, just because that's where our headquarters is. We have some openings in Menlo Park, and then more and more in Austin, Texas, within the US. And then internationally, honestly, I couldn't even say. International, we are growing pretty quickly, and we're popping up in new offices. Feels like every 6 months, and so there are opportunities there as well.
Great, I think we're out of time, so Jason, thank you so much for your time.